The Roman arena made violence look controlled, blood on sand, rules enforced by officials, and a crowd trained to see winners and losers as part of a civic ritual. But in Roman society, victory often marked the end of public danger and the beginning of private, unrecorded suffering, especially for women caught in the machinery of conquest and slavery. Chapter 1. Victory isn't the end. Cold open. In the early Roman Empire, the amphitheater was not just entertainment, it was a public language of power. Games like munera, gladiator combats, and venationes, hunts, staged with wild animals, were commonly funded by an editor, a magistrate or wealthy sponsor who used spectacle to win prestige, demonstrate generosity, and signal control over life and death. The violence was extreme, but it was also organized: schedules, staff, gates, seating hierarchies, and rules enforced by officials. Even the fighters were part of a managed system. Many gladiators were enslaved or condemned, trained in schools called ludi under a lanista, who invested in food, medical care, and instruction because trained men were expensive property. Survival in the arena could mean increased value, better treatment, or continued employment, but it did not mean freedom from the wider Roman order. That wider order was built on captivity. Roman expansion produced prisoners through war, raids, and punitive campaigns, and those captives were absorbed into an economy that treated human beings as transferable assets. 4. Women taken in conquest or swept into enslavement. There was rarely a single decision moment, like the one dramatized in films. Their fate was typically decided through ownership, sale, assignment, coercion, processes that happened away from the crowd. So, after the victory is not a metaphor, it is a shift in setting, from public spectacle to private domination, where the empire's most routine forms of violence could continue without witnesses. Chapter 2. Who were these female captives? In Roman terms, a female captive was not a single category. She could be a prisoner taken in a formal war, a civilian seized in a raid, a hostage absorbed into slavery after a revolt, or a condemned person whose legal status had collapsed through debt, punishment, or an imperial sentence. Rome's sources often blur these distinctions because the system that followed treated them similarly. Once a woman became serva, enslaved, her identity was reduced to status, not story. Rome's expansion across the Mediterranean created a steady flow of captives. Major campaigns routinely produced mass enslavement, and ancient authors describe the aftermath of conquest in economic terms: people counted, sorted, and sold. Markets in Italy and the provinces absorbed captives through auctions managed by dealers, with prices shaped by age, health, skills, and perceived use. This was not a side effect of empire, it was a core feature. Enslaved labor sustained households, agriculture, workshops, and state projects, while also enriching commanders, contractors, and traders. The legal reality made the transition brutal. Roman law recognized enslaved people as property, res, not as independent legal persons. That means a captive woman's protections were thin to non-existent, especially compared to freeborn citizens. Her relationships could be broken by sale, her location could change overnight, her labor could be reassigned without appeal. Even when individual owners behaved differently, the framework was consistent. Consent carried little weight when a human being could be bought, transferred, and punished as someone else's asset. This is why capture was not merely defeat, it was a permanent change in legal reality, one that could erase a life without leaving a public record. Chapter 3. The arena's ecosystem. Gladiators, managers, and money gladiators were not independent warriors roaming Rome. They were part of a regulated entertainment industry, tied to contracts, owners, and financial risk. Many were enslaved, condemned criminals, damnati, or men who signed on voluntarily for pay and status, but regardless of origin, most operated under tight control. Their training took place in schools called ludi, overseen by a lanista who functioned as manager, investor, and disciplinarian. A skilled fighter represented real capital, food, housing, medical care, and years of training. This business reality shaped what victory meant. A gladiator's survival was valuable to the people who owned or sponsored him. Inscriptions and literary references suggest that successful fighters could gain fame, gifts, and occasional privileges, but the structure remained commercial. The arena ran on spectacle, and spectacle ran on money, ticketed seating, elite sponsorship, advertising through public generosity, and the political benefits that came from staging a crowd-pleasing show. That matters because it corrects a common misunderstanding. Popular storytelling often treats gladiators as free agents who took whatever they wanted. After a fight, in practice, many gladiators lived under surveillance and restrictions. Because they were property or contract-bound performers, their movements, punishments, and rewards were shaped by owners, trainers, and the sponsor of the games. Meanwhile, the people brought into the arena's orbit, condemned prisoners, enslaved workers, and captives, existed at the opposite end of the same economy. The amphitheater did not only display violence. It advertised Rome's power to control bodies, to train them, rent them, sell them, and dispose of them. After the crowd left, that machinery continued, quietly, through markets, households, and private coercion. Chapter 4. What, after the victory, actually means in Rome. After the victory did not mean a single ritual where captives were formally handed over to gladiators as prizes. That image comes mostly from modern entertainment. In Roman reality, the after was a legal and economic process, one that worked through ownership and status. For women taken in war or absorbed into slavery, the crucial fact was simple: once enslaved, a person's life could be directed by an owner's interests. Roman society normalized this through law and custom. Captives could be registered, held, sold, transferred, rented out for labor, or assigned to a household or workplace. These were not exceptional outcomes reserved for the arena. This was everyday Roman practice across the empire. That is also why the most important violence was often invisible. Public spectacles were staged under civic authority, but the routine exercise of control happened privately. Discipline in a household, coercion in a workshop, punishment on an estate, or resale. When an owner wanted cash, Roman writers occasionally acknowledge the intimate vulnerability of the enslaved, but the sources rarely preserve the enslaved person's perspective, because Roman recordkeeping prioritized property transactions and elite reputations, not victim testimony. So, after the victory is best understood as a change of setting. The arena's danger was loud, supervised, and time-limited. The empire's broader system, slavery, forced labor, and the power imbalance built into ownership, was quiet and ongoing. For a captive woman, survival did not end the threat. It often means entering a world where the terms of life could be rewritten repeatedly, without public scrutiny or meaningful legal protection. Chapter 5. The Dark Pipeline. From captive to commodity. Once a woman entered Roman captivity, the next steps were rarely dramatic, but they were systematic. In many provinces, captives from wars, rebellions, and raids were gathered, sorted, and moved along established routes toward sale. Ancient sources describe post-conquest enslavement as an expected consequence of victory. And Rome's commercial networks were built to absorb large numbers of people. The destination was often an auction, where enslaved individuals were displayed, assessed, and priced based on age, health, and perceived usefulness. From there, assignment could mean almost anything, and that uncertainty was part of the terror. Some women were sent into domestic service in urban households, work that could include cooking, cleaning, textile production, childcare, and personal attendance. Others were moved into workshops that produced clothing, pottery, or luxury goods. Many were sent to agricultural estates, where labor was grueling and discipline could be harsh. In the worst labor settings, mines and quarries, ancient writers portray conditions as punishing and life expectancy as low. Sexual exploitation was not a separate category outside this system, it was a risk built into it. Roman law and custom treated enslaved bodies as accessible to owners and commercial. Sex existed as a business that used enslaved people as inventory. A captive might be sold, resold, or rented out, her daily reality. Determined not by justice or innocence, but by whoever held legal power over her. This is why "worse than death" appears in historical discussions of enslavement, not as a slogan, but as a description of prolonged, transferable vulnerability, suffering that could continue indefinitely, and could be repeated under new owners, without any public trial, arena, or endpoint. Chapter 6. The Myth versus the Reality. Gladiators took women as rewards. Modern films in viral history clips often repeat a simple trope. A victorious gladiator claims a woman as a prize. It fits the arena fantasy, one dramatic moment that turns victory into ownership, but the surviving evidence from Roman antiquity points to a more complicated, less cinematic truth. Gladiators were rarely free agents. Many were enslaved, or contract-bound performers living under strict supervision in the ludus. Their bodies had market value, and managers had financial reasons to control where they went, who they met, and how they behaved. They could receive rewards, money, gifts, public fame, sometimes legal privileges, but those rewards were typically mediated by owners, sponsors, or patrons. The idea that a gladiator routinely took captives as personal property doesn't match how property and custody actually worked in most documented cases. What is clearly documented is the larger structure around them. Roman society accepted slavery as normal, and it also accepted that enslaved people had little control over their bodies or futures. Sexual access to enslaved women was treated by many Romans as an extension of ownership, not as a crime against a person with equal legal standing. That reality existed whether or not gladiators were involved. So the correction is not that the post-arena world was less brutal. It's that brutality was systemic rather than theatrical. If a captive woman suffered after a spectacle, it usually isn't because of a formal prize ceremony. It was because Roman law and economics made her transferable property, vulnerable to exploitation by owners, buyers, brokers, and anyone empowered by her lack of legal personhood. Chapter 7. Women, Law, and the Roman Double Standard. Roman society was built around status, and the law reflected that hierarchy. For freeborn citizens, especially those from respected families, sexual violation could be framed as an attack on household honor and social order. But for enslaved women, the same act was usually treated as a matter of property, not personal rights. The dividing line was not morality, it was legal category. Roman jurists and social norms distinguished sharply between the matrona, the respectable citizen wife, whose chastity was tied to family reputation, and the enslaved woman, whose body could be claimed as an extension of ownership. Enslaved people had limited avenues for legal complaint, and their testimony often carried less weight. Punishment, discipline, and coercion were not only tolerated, they were embedded in the expected authority of masters and managers. Even when Roman moralists criticized excess, the system itself remained intact. This double standard also shapes the historical record. Roman authors wrote abundantly about emperors, generals, and public spectacles, but far less about what happened inside ordinary households, workshops, and slave quarters, especially from the perspective of the enslaved. Women in captivity appear in sources as numbers after conquests, as items at auctions, or as background figures in elite life. Their individual experiences are harder to recover because Rome did not preserve them as stories worth recording. That silence is not neutral. It is part of the evidence. It shows where Roman society placed attention and sympathy, and where it did not. When historians describe the post-victory suffering of captives, they are often reconstructing realities that were common enough to be assumed, yet private enough to leave minimal direct testimony. In Rome, the law protected status more than vulnerability, and that imbalance defined what captives could expect after the crowd went home. Chapter 8. Survival Strategies and Small Forms of Resistance. Even inside a system designed to deny agency, captive women were not simply passive. The evidence is uneven, because Roman sources rarely preserve enslaved voices, but surviving inscriptions, legal texts, and documentary material from the wider Roman world show that enslaved people sometimes pursued limited strategies to improve their odds. None of these guaranteed safety, but they could shape outcomes at the margins. One strategy was skill. Women with valued abilities, textile work, household management, nursing, accounting, or specialized craft labor, could be placed in less physically destructive settings than fields or mines. In some cases, skilled enslaved workers were trusted with responsibilities that increased their bargaining power within a household or workshop, even if they remained unfree. Another strategy was relationship building. Forming protective ties with other enslaved workers, sympathetic freedpeople, or patrons connected to the household. These networks could help someone avoid the worst assignments, survive illness, or secure small resources. Manumission, formal release from slavery, was also possible. Though never simple, some enslaved people were freed by owners through manumissio, often for long service, as a reward, or through purchase of freedom. The freed status, liberta, offered legal recognition and new possibilities, but it could still involve obligations to former owners, and it was not equally accessible to everyone. Resistance existed too, but it was constrained. Roman law treated flight, refusal, or disruption as punishable, and the threat of sale or violence kept many people compliant. What survives in the record are brief glimpses. Runaways advertised for capture, legal disputes over ownership, and inscriptions that hint at lives rebuilt after enslavement. The larger truth is that survival often depended on navigating power carefully, seeking safer placements, accumulating skills, and enduring long enough for a narrow door to open. Chapter 9, Closing. The real, worse than death. The arena is what modern audiences remember because it is visible, architecture, artwork, famous names, and a clear beginning and end. But Rome's greatest violence was not always staged in stone. It ran through ordinary transactions. A sale, a transfer, a punishment, an assignment to a harsher workplace, a separation from family. These were not dramatic scenes meant for applause. They were routine mechanisms of an empire built on conquest and labor. That is what the phrase, worse than death, points toward when used carefully. Death in the arena was immediate and public. Enslavement could be indefinite and private, marked by repeated loss of control over movement, work, relationships, and bodily autonomy. And because Roman society recognized enslaved people primarily as property, the system could continue with little accountability. A captive's suffering did not require a tribunal or a crowd. It required only an owner's power and society's acceptance. This isn't about turning Rome into a caricature of cruelty. It is about accuracy. Roman civilization produced extraordinary engineering, law, and literature, but it also normalized human ownership on a massive scale. The amphitheater did not create that reality, it displayed it. So when we ask what happened after the victory, we are really asking what a society does when it can exercise total control over another human being. Rome answered that question not only in the sand of the Colosseum, but in the quiet spaces beyond it, where there were no cheers, no judges, and often, no record at all. If you want more historically grounded documentaries that go beyond the myths and into the real machinery of ancient empires, subscribe to Silent Scholars. Like the video so it reaches more history lovers, and comment below, what part of Rome should we investigate next? The slave markets, the gladiator schools, or the laws that made captivity normal?